3 years that's how long Kong Ji-hyuk searched for the Omega who marked him. 3 years of turning over every stone, burning every bridge, tearing through every shadowy corner of the territories like a man possessed by something he couldn't name and couldn't control. 3 years of waking up in cold sweats with the ghost of a scent in his nostrils and the mark on his neck throbbing like a second heartbeat. 3 years. And the only thing he had left was the child. The intel arrived on a gray Tuesday morning, delivered by a messenger who was trembling so badly he could barely hold the tablet. Ji-hyuk didn't blame him. He had become someone who made people tremble. Somewhere in the past 3 years, the cold control that had defined his empire had curdled into something sharper, something unpredictable. The men who had served him for decades now approached him like they were handling explosives. "Sir," Do-hyun's voice was measured, the careful tone of a man who had learned exactly where the tripwires were. "We've confirmed the child's location. A border town in the southern province. Population under 2,000. No significant mafia presence. Easy to miss if you're not looking." Ji-hyuk stood at the window of his study, the same window he had stood at 1,000 times before, watching the rain streak down the glass like the tears he had never shed. And the Omega? No confirmation yet, but the child matches the signatures. There's no doubt. No doubt. The words settled into Ji-hyuk's chest and burned there. For 3 years, he had been chasing a ghost, an Omega who had slipped through his defenses, taken advantage of his rut, and disappeared without leaving so much as a fingerprint behind. He had interrogated every guard, reviewed every scrap of footage, followed every lead until it crumbled into nothing. He had torn apart his own organization looking for the traitor. He had executed 2 men on suspicion alone. He had become something his own mother would not recognize, and all the while, the mark on his neck had burned. With the memory of something he couldn't quite reach, he had changed. Since that night, everyone knew it. The Omegas he used to take to his bed without a second thought now repulsed him. Their sense triggered something violent in him. A rejection so visceral it felt like being poisoned. He had hurt one of them, early on. A beautiful female Omega who had done nothing wrong, whose only crime was not being the one his body remembered. He had grabbed her throat before he knew what he was doing. His instincts roaring wrong, wrong, wrong. And he had nearly killed her. The guards had pulled him off, and he had locked himself in his quarters for 3 days, staring at his own hands like they belonged to a stranger. He didn't arrange Omegas anymore after that. He didn't trust himself near anyone. The rut came and went, and he endured it alone, chained to his own bed like an animal. The mark on his neck pulsing with a need he couldn't satisfy and couldn't escape. Someone had done this to him. Someone had crawled into his bed during his most vulnerable moment and rewritten his biology. Someone had left something inside him that he couldn't remove, couldn't override, couldn't kill. And when he found them, when he finally found them, he was going to make them pay for every sleepless night, every ruined rut, every moment of weakness they had carved into his flesh. But first, he had to understand. And the child was the key. "Bring the child," Ji-hyuk said. His voice was cold and absolute. The voice of a man who had stopped negotiating with the world years ago. Alive, unharmed. "I don't care what it takes." "And the Omega, sir?" Ji-hyuk turned from the window. His eyes were dark and hollow. The eyes of someone who had been starving for something he couldn't name. "The child will lead us to the Omega. They always do. 600 miles away, in a quiet border town, where the sea met the mountains, and the air smelled of salt and pine." Han Eriks was teaching his son how to count. 7, Hyun said, pointing at the eggs in the carton. His small finger moved deliberately from one egg to the next. 8, 9. That's right. Eriks kept his voice light, though exhaustion pulled at every muscle. He had worked a double shift at the bookshop yesterday, and his body was still recovering. "What comes after 9? Hyun considered the question with the seriousness he brought to everything. He was not a child who rushed. Even at 2.5, he approached the world with a deliberate, almost unnerving intensity, observing, calculating, deciding. His dark eyes, so familiar they made Eriks's chest ache every time he looked at them, moved from the eggs to his father's face. 10, Hyun said finally. 10 eggs. Smart boy. Eriks reached out and smoothed Hyun's dark hair back from his forehead. The gesture was automatic, a habit born of years of being the only parent this child had ever known. "Now help me put them away." They worked together in the small kitchen, Hyun handing Eriks the eggs one by one with the intense focus of someone defusing a bomb. The apartment was tiny, a kitchen, a bedroom, a bathroom, all of it worn and imperfect and nothing like the sterile compound where Eric's had spent a decade of his life. But it was his. It was theirs. And he loved it with a ferocity that still surprised him. Appa. Hyun's voice was thoughtful, the way it always was when he was about to ask something complicated. Do I have a father? Eric's hand stopped mid-motion, an egg suspended between his fingers. He forced himself to breathe, to continue the motion, to set the egg down gently in the carton. Everyone has a father, Hyuna. It's how babies are made. But where is mine? The question hung in the air between them. Eric's had been dreading it for 2 years, had rehearsed a dozen different answers, and now that it was here, none of them felt adequate. Your father is far away, he said carefully. He doesn't know about you. And that's for the best. Why? Because sometimes people aren't ready to be parents. Sometimes they're not safe to be around. Eric's crouched down, bringing himself to Hyun's level. But I am here. I will always be here. And I love you enough for 2 parents. Okay. Hyun looked at him with those dark, watchful eyes, Ji-hyuk's eyes. Impossible to deny, and said nothing. Then he nodded once and handed Eric's the next egg. That night, after Hyun was asleep, Eric sat by the window and watched the street below. The town was quiet at this hour. The only movement, the distant sway of fishing boats in the harbor. It should have been peaceful. It had been peaceful for nearly 2 years. But something had shifted in the past few weeks. A tension in the air, a wrongness at the edges of his perception. The Omega instincts he had spent years suppressing were screaming, and he had learned, over a decade of surviving, never to ignore them. He had left in the dead of night 3 years ago, slipping through security gaps he had designed himself, carrying nothing except emergency cash and forged documents and the desperate, irrational hope that he could outrun the most powerful alpha in the Eastern Territories. He had traveled for weeks, moving from town to town, never staying in one place long enough to leave a trace. He had given birth alone in a charity clinic, gripping the edges of a narrow bed and biting his lip until it bled, refusing to scream because screaming drew attention, and attention could get him killed. And when they had placed Hyun in his arms, small and red and screaming with the fury of new life, Eric's had looked into those dark, familiar eyes and felt something shift inside him. Something fundamental, something permanent. He was not just running anymore. He was protecting. But protection required more than fear. It required vigilance. And his vigilance was telling him that the walls were closing in. The first sign of danger came 3 days later, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. Eric's was at the bookshop, shelving new inventory, when he noticed the man across the street. He was standing too still, watching too intently. His posture was too controlled, the posture of someone who had been trained to observe without being observed. Eric's had trained men like that, once. He had taught them how to stand, how to watch, how to disappear into the background of everyday life. He recognized his own lessons in the stranger's stance. He finished his shift without rushing. His movements were calm, unhurried. The same rhythm he had maintained for 3 years of hiding. But his mind was racing, cataloging every detail, every exit, every contingency he had mapped out months ago and hoped he would never need. When he picked Hyun up from the neighbor's apartment, he didn't take their usual route home. He took the long way, weaving through back streets and alleyways, doubling back twice, his senses straining for any sign of pursuit. Hyun, perceptive as always, looked up at him with those dark, knowing eyes. Appa, are we playing the quiet game? Yes, baby. Eric's kept his voice steady, though his heart was hammering against his ribs. We're playing the quiet game. We're going to see how quietly we can get home. They made it back to the apartment without incident. But that night, after Hyun was asleep, Eric's packed a bag. Essential documents. Emergency cash. Enough clothes for a week. He hid it in the crawl space beneath the floorboards. The same place he had hidden it in every home they had lived in. Then he sat by the window and waited. He didn't sleep. He couldn't. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Ji-hyuk's face, not the cold, controlled mask he had worn for 10 years, but the raw, desperate hunger that had consumed him during that rut. The way his hands had gripped Eric's hips. The way his voice had cracked when he said Eric's name. The way his body had recognized what his mind refused to see. He's coming, Eric's thought, and the thought was a cold stone in his chest. After all this time, he's finally coming. The escape happened 2 nights later, in the slim hours between midnight and dawn. Eric's had been planning for this moment since the day Hyun was born. He had mapped out 3 different exit routes from the town, memorized the schedules of the fishing boats and the cargo trucks, and the one bus that ran between the border towns. He had saved enough money for new identities, new documents, a new start in a place even more remote than this one. He had almost made it. They slipped out through the back window. Hyun bundled against the cold and strapped to Eric's chest in a carrier he had modified himself. The night was dark and moonless, the kind of night that swallowed light and sound. Eric's moved through the shadows with the silence of someone who had spent his whole life learning to be invisible. The harbor was 15 minutes away if you knew the back routes. Eric's knew them. He had timed it, practiced it, walked the path 100 times in daylight so he could navigate it blind. The fishing boat left at 4:30 a.m. The captain owed him a favor and didn't ask questions. By sunrise, they would be 2 towns over, and by nightfall, they would be gone. He was 3 streets from the harbor when the scent hit him. Ji-hyuk's men. Not close, not yet, but close enough. Their alpha pheromones cut through the salt air like a blade, and Eric's omega senses flared in warning. He pressed himself into a doorway, one hand covering Hyun's mouth gently, the other reaching for the knife in his pocket. Footsteps. 2 men, maybe 3. Their voices were low, too low to make out words, but their tone was unmistakable. They were hunting. Eric's waited, counted his breaths. Hyun was utterly still against his chest, his small body trusting and warm. The footsteps grew louder, then softer, then faded into the distance. He ran. The harbor was dark when he reached it. The fishing boat was there, bobbing gently against the dock, its engine already rumbling. The captain, a grizzled old beta, who had never asked why Eric's paid in cash and kept to himself, was untying the ropes. Early, the captain said. Change of plans. Eric's climbed aboard, one hand still pressed protectively against Hyun's back. Can we leave now? The captain looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at the dark street behind him, at the shadows that seemed to move in ways shadows shouldn't. Get below, he said. Don't come up until I tell you. Eric's nodded. He was halfway down the narrow steps to the cabin when the spotlight hit the boat. It was blinding, white and merciless, turning the harbor into a stage. Eric's froze, his hand gripping the railing. His body caught between the impulse to run and the knowledge that there was nowhere left to run to. Han Eric's. The voice came from the dock. Not Ji-hyuk's voice, someone younger, sharper. One of the lieutenants who had risen through the ranks after Eric's disappeared. We know you're on that boat. Come out slowly, and no one gets hurt. The child is coming with us regardless. How this goes depends on you. Appa. Hyun's voice was small, confused. Who was that? Eric's closed his eyes. For one suspended moment, he let himself feel the full weight of what was happening. 3 years of running. 3 years of hiding. 3 years of building a life from nothing, only to have it ripped away at the last possible second. Then he opened his eyes, straightened his spine, pressed a kiss to Hyun's forehead. It's okay, baby. Appa's here. Just stay quiet, no matter what happens. Can you do that? Hyun nodded, his dark eyes serious. I can do that. Eric's climbed back up to the deck, his hands raised, his expression calm. The spotlight was still blinding, but he could make out the shapes of men on the dock. 5 of them, armed, waiting. The child stays with me, Eric said, his voice carrying across the water with a steadiness he didn't feel. Those are my terms. If Ji-hyuk wants to see him, he goes through me first. The lieutenant on the dock laughed. It wasn't a kind sound. You're not in a position to negotiate. Omega, I trained half the men in this organization. Eric's voice didn't waver. I know every protocol, every contingency, every weakness in your operation. If you think I don't have leverage, you're stupider than you look. The laughter stopped. There was a long, tense silence. Then the lieutenant's voice came again, flatter this time. Bring them both. Boss's orders. They were transported in a black car with tinted windows. The kind of car Eric's had arranged 100 times for 100 different operations. The irony wrapped around his throat like a noose. He had built the systems that were now carrying him to his fate. He had trained the men who now guarded him. He had designed the protocols that now held him captive. Hyun sat beside him, his small hand clutched in Eric's, his dark eyes watching the passing countryside with quiet curiosity. He hadn't cried, hadn't screamed or fought or done any of the things normal children did when strangers took them from their homes. He had simply looked at the men with those calm, assessing eyes, Ji-hyuk's eyes, and waited. That terrified Eric's more than the guns, more than the handcuffs, more than the cold certainty of Ji-hyuk's wrath. His son was too much like his father. The journey took 2 days. They stopped twice at safe houses. Eric's recognized compounds he had helped establish years ago, when he was still the trusted fixer and not the hunted fugitive. The guards treated him with a strange, uneasy respect, bringing food for Hyun, blankets for the cold nights. Never meeting Eric's eyes directly, some of them remembered him. Some of them owed their positions to the training he had given them. "We could let you go," one of them whispered, during a shift change in the gray hours of dawn. He was young, barely more than a boy, his eyes flickering nervously toward the door. "Some of the men, we talked about it. You were always decent to us, Hannes SI. Not like the others." Eric's looked at him for a long moment. Then he shook his head. "He would hunt you. He would find you. And he would kill you slowly. But protect yourself." Eric's voice was gentle but final. "That's an order. Don't throw away your life for a man who's already caught." The guard said nothing more. But when he left, there were extra blankets folded on the end of the bed, and Hyun's favorite crackers on the nightstand. They arrived at the compound on the evening of the third day. The gates opened with a sound Eric's remembered in his bones. The courtyard was exactly the same gravel, the same guards, the same cold, imposing architecture that had been his entire world for a decade. The car stopped. The door opened, and Eric stepped out into the life he had fled, his son's hand still clutched in his. They were taken to a room. Not a cell. Ji-hyuk's men had been careful about that, but a room, with a locked door and guarded windows and the unmistakable atmosphere of captivity. It was larger than Eric's expected, with a real bed and a chair and even a small table with a lamp. Someone had left children's books on the nightstand. Someone had remembered that there was a child involved. Eric sat on the bed with Hyun in his lap, and he waited. He didn't have to wait long. The door opened, and Kang Ji-hyuk walked in. Time seemed to bend. For one disorienting moment, Eric's was 26 again, standing in this same compound, looking at this same alpha, feeling the same impossible mix of love and terror that had defined his entire existence. Ji-hyuk looked exactly the same cold features, the same predatory stillness, the same dark eyes that seemed to swallow light. But there were differences too. Shadows beneath his eyes that hadn't been there before, a gauntness to his cheeks, a tension in his shoulders that spoke of years of sleepless nights. And his scent hit Eric's like a physical force, overwhelming and familiar and devastating. Spice and smoke and something else, something sharper, more desperate, that hadn't been there 3 years ago. The suppressant's Eric's was still taking muted his own scent, but Ji-hyuk's was unmuted, and it was screaming. The mark on Ji-hyuk's neck was visible above his collar, dark, permanent, the claiming bite that had never healed. Ji-hyuk stopped in the center of the room. For a long, suspended moment, his eyes were on Hyun, on the small, serious face that held his features, on the dark eyes that mirrored his own, on the living proof of a night he couldn't remember and had never been able to forget. His expression didn't soften. Ji-hyuk's expressions had never softened easily, but something shifted in it, something raw and unguarded that Eric's had never seen before. Then his gaze moved to Eric's, and the shift was seismic. Eric's. The name came out rough, hoarse, dragged from somewhere deep. His pupils dilated. His scent spiked, sharp, overwhelming, the scent of an alpha, whose body knew what his mind was only beginning to piece together. "You were the Omega." It wasn't a question. It wasn't an accusation. It was a revelation, the kind that rewrites everything that came before it. "I was," Eric said quietly. "I always was." Ji-hyuk took a step forward. His body seemed to move without his permission, drawn toward Eric's like iron to a magnet. The mark on his neck was pulsing visibly, and his hands, those cold, steady hands that had never trembled, were shaking. "You hid from me." His voice was strange, strained, caught between rage and something that sounded almost like grief. "For 5 years before that night. For 3 years after. You stood beside me every single day, and you never asked." Eric's voice was quiet but unflinching. "You never looked. You saw what you wanted to see, a beta, a tool, someone useful. You never once thought I could be anything else, even when I was right in front of you." Another step. Ji-hyuk was close now, close enough that Eric's could see the fine tremor in his hands, the rapid pulse in his throat, the way his scent kept spiking and crashing like a wave against rocks. His body knew. It had known the moment he entered the room. The child. Ji-hyuk's voice cracked on the word. He's yours. Eric's pulled Hyun closer, his arms wrapping protectively around the small body. His name is Hyun. He's 2.5 years old. He has your eyes and your stubbornness, and your complete inability to sleep through the night. He likes eggs and picture books and the sound of rain. He's never met you, and he's still more like you than I want to admit. Ji-hyuk stared at the child, at his child, at the proof of a night that had changed everything. You ruined me, he said finally. The words were barely above a whisper. That night, the mark. I can't. There's no one else. My body rejects everyone. I can't rut without. I nearly killed someone. A woman. She did nothing wrong. And I nearly killed her because she wasn't. He broke off, his jaw clenching so hard the muscles stood out like cords. Do you know what you did to me? I know. Eric's voice was quiet. And I'm sorry for that part. Truly. But I'm not sorry for him. He looked down at Hyun, who was watching Ji-hyuk with those dark, unreadable eyes. I will never be sorry for him. Ji-hyuk's hand moved. Involuntarily, it seemed, reaching toward Hyun, then stopping, hovering in the air between them. For the first time in the decade Eric's had known him, Kang Ji-hyuk looked uncertain, lost, like a man standing on the edge of something he had no map for. I'm not going to kill you, he said. The words seemed to cost him something. I should. Every part of me wants to. But I'm not going to. Eric's didn't relax. The fear was still there, coiled tight in his chest. Then what do you want? Ji-hyuk was silent for a long moment. His hand was still hovering in the air, frozen between reaching and withdrawing. His scent was still spiking, his body still screaming recognition, at a frequency his mind couldn't quite process. I don't know, he said finally. I've spent 3 years trying to find you so I could destroy you. And now you're here, and there's a child. And my body is, he stopped, swallowed. His eyes, dark and hollow and desperate, met Eric's. What did you do to me that night? Why can't I forget you? Why can't I stop? I don't know, Eric said. And it was the truth. He didn't know why the mark hadn't faded. He didn't know why Ji-hyuk's body had rejected everyone else. He didn't know if it was biology or fate or something crueler that had bound them together, against all logic. But he knew one thing. If you came here to kill me, Eric said quietly, then do it. But you don't touch him. You don't go near him. You don't even look at him unless I'm standing between you. Ji-hyuk looked at Hyun again, at the small, serious face, at the dark eyes that were his own, at the child who had been hidden from him for 3 years. The rut is coming, he said. His voice was different now, quieter, almost afraid. In 2 weeks, maybe less. I can feel it building. And I can't. He broke off, his jaw working. I can't go through another one alone. It's getting worse. Each time, it gets worse. Eric's blood ran cold. He remembered Ji-hyuk's ruts, the violence of them, the way they consumed everything in their path, the way his control shattered and left only instinct. He remembered the night that had started all of this, the way Ji-hyuk had grabbed him, the way his voice had cracked on the word, don't leave. And you think I can help you? Eric's voice was sharper than he intended. After everything? After 3 years of hunting me? After threatening to kill me? I don't know. Ji-hyuk's voice was raw. I don't know anything anymore. I just know that my body recognized you the moment you walked into this compound. Before I even saw your face, I knew you were here. I knew it was you. He stepped back. The movement seemed to cost him something physical, his muscles straining against the pull of whatever was drawing him toward Eric's. You'll stay here, both of you, until I decide what to do. He paused at the door, his hand on the frame, his back to Eric's. When he spoke again, his voice was barely audible. I won't hurt the child. I wouldn't, he stopped. Started again. He has my eyes. Then he was gone, and the door clicked shut, and Eric's was left alone with his son and his fear and the terrible, terrifying realization that Kang Ji-hyuk was not the same alpha he had fled. Something had changed. Something was still changing, and the rut was coming.
Right, so part 2 is done, and I know you have a lot of questions about this story, so let me try to answer few of them while I process what just happened. So first, why did Ji Yok search for 3 years if he just wanted to kill the Omega? Great question. Here's my take. He didn't just want revenge. He wanted answers, like how the hell Omega can control him with just a mark, like he couldn't move on, and was just that's just not an obsession anymore. That's bond withdrawal. His alpha instinct recognized it as his mate when he first saw him, even though his brain refused to accept it. So he told himself he was hunting a criminal, but really he was hunting the only person who could fix him. So why didn't just Eric just tell him the truth from the beginning? I think it's pure fear. Simple as that. Bone deep fear. Eric spent a decade hiding what he was because he knew Jiyuk despised male omegas. He seen Jiyuk fire capable people for their secondary gender. He heard the cold, cruel joke coming out of as an omega would have cost him everything. His position, his safety, his life, and when he got pregnant, that wasn't a confession, that was a death sentence. So he just ran. No, because he was weak, because he was trying to survive. Why didn't Jiyok recognize Eric's scent that night? Okay. So it's simple as that. Suppressants, high grade, black market suppressant, that medicine that help conceal all these hormones that Eric's had been taken for years. They masked his omega hormones so completely that even during Jiyok's route, when instincts are at their lowest, all Jiyok's body knew was that someone was right, not who. That's why he was so shattered, because his nose is finally clear and he is realizing the person he's been hunting was the one standing beside him the whole time. What's going to happen with Hyun? Here is the wild card. Jayuk said he wouldn't like hurt the child, and I believe him, but not hurting and being a father are two different things. Jayuk doesn't know how to love softly. He doesn't know how to be gentle. And Hyun is perceptive. He watches everything. He's already figuring out that something is wrong. Part 3 is gonna be fun, baby, because part 3 is going to explore whether Gio can run to be a parents or if his obsession with Eric's been blind him to the child who need him the most. Is there hope for Eric's and Gio? To be honest, I don't know, and I'm not going to pretend I do. The mark is here, it's binding them in a way neither of them choose. But a bond isn't love, it's biology, it's instinct. It's the cost of something that could become real if people are like willing to do the work. Right now, Jiyuk has to run the ride to even in the same room as Iris, and Iris has to decide whether the man who hunted him for 3 years is someone he can ever trust again. So, part 3 is gonna coming soon. Geo control is fucking cracking. Eric is trapped in the compound with nowhere left to run. And somewhere in the middle of all that chaos, there's a 2-year-old who just want to know why his father look at him like a stranger. So subscribe if you want to see what happens when the hunter finally has to stop running and start choosing. Let me know in the comments. Do you think you deserve a second chance, or should Eric take Hyun and disappear again? I want to know your thoughts. Thank you so much for watching. Bye bye.